Thanks for tuning into Wine Blast. Sign up to Wine Blast Plus to support the show, enjoy early access to all episodes, and get exclusive subscriber-only content. Just visit wineblast.co.uk or click the link in the show notes. We currently have a 15% early bird discount, so don't hang around.
Hello, you're listening to Wine Blast. Welcome to our wine-fueled world, and you catch us in the middle of a compelling story about the mystery of the world's most expensive bottle of wine.
So this is the second and concluding part of our Billionaire's Vinegar story. In the first part, we met the main protagonists, got a taste for the heady wine boom times, and enjoyed the drama of the 1985 auction in which a bottle of 1787 Chateau Lafite, engraved with Thomas Jefferson's initials, sold for a record-breaking £105,000, making it the most expensive bottle of wine ever sold at the time.
Before the cork fell in, making it the most expensive bottle of vinegar on the planet. Meanwhile, though, doubts were being raised about the authenticity of this bottle and the trustworthiness of its consignor, wine collector and dealer Hardy Rodenstock. Here's a taster of what one of the investigations threw up and its ramifications.
In the basement, he found empty old wine bottles, a stack of blank wine labels, old labels. He found a pile of dirt with a dead frog in it and with mold all over it. Obviously, this was Rodenstock's laboratory where he was creating his old bottles of wine. I think there was a gradual kind of waking up from the slumber of the romance of the wine world where nothing like this could ever happen, would ever happen. The bloom was off the rose. The innocence was lost.
Benjamin Wallace there, author of the 2008 book, The Billionaire's Vinegar. So the ideal voice to talk us through this fascinating story and its aftermath. But before we dive right back in, there are a couple of things to preface, aren't there?
Indeed. So it's worth bearing in mind the story told by Rodenstock of how he had found this unique cache of 18th century wines. He said that building works in Paris had knocked through a brick wall into a hidden cellar, where a number of bottles of wine had been miraculously preserved since French Revolution times in perfect condition, including top Bordeaux's like Chateau Lafite and Yquem. The hoard included an unspecified number of bottles engraved with the initials THJ, which were quickly associated with US founding father Thomas Jefferson. These became known as the Jefferson bottles.
And just a couple of details relating to Bordeaux. Chateau Petrus is the famous Pomerol estate that commands eye-watering prices, made in tiny quantities, and very much a favourite with collectors. Much the same can be said of Chateau d'Yquem, the famously unctuous and long-lived sweet wine from Sauternes in Bordeaux, which was owned and run by the Leurs-Salus family from 1785 to 1996. And Bran Mouton is the old name for Chateau Mouton Rothschild, these days one of the 5 Bordeaux first growths, so the top red estates of the left bank.
Monticello was Thomas Jefferson's residence in Virginia, which more recently has been transformed into a museum and educational institution run by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation.
Finally, we touch on dating wines by measuring radioactive isotopes. This is complicated, but one simple takeaway is that agricultural products like wine retain traces of their environment. Since hydrogen and nuclear bomb testing began in the 1940s and 50s, cesium-137 isotopes have been detectable in the atmosphere and in wine, in varying quantities year to year, but not so much in wines before that time. So if you test a very old wine and it has high levels of cesium-137, it's a fake. Physics lesson over.
Ooh. Thanks for that. Right, so I asked Benjamin to give us an insight into the world of Thomas Jefferson, his possessions and memorabilia, and the place of specific wines within that, particularly the 1787 Lafite.
One of the things I looked into was if this was a Jefferson bottle, like how might it have ended up in this bricked up cellar? And was there a record of him ordering 1787 Lafitte? Jefferson was like what today we might call OCD about record keeping. The leading Jefferson scholar at Monticello, this woman, Cinder Stanton, said, he didn't have a wastebasket and he was a hero of meticulousness. It was just unbelievable, like his redundant record keeping. Every bottle of wine he'd ever bought, there was a record of. And there was a record of it in like 4 different places. And so, there was quite a paper trail on like what had happened to all of his possessions. But there were also some blank areas of mystery where conceivably a bottle or a case or more than a case could have gone missing. I mean, there was at one point, there was a ship that was bringing a bunch of his possessions up the coast of the U.S. that, went down in a storm. There was a fire at some point. There was a lot of kind of drama with his possessions after his death as well. And so over the years, these things occasionally would pop up, like they'd just be found in weird places or they would come to auction out of nowhere. And so, there was kind of a diaspora of Jefferson's possessions, and there was simultaneously an attempt to gather them up by Monticello, which was establishing itself as this kind of historic repository and museum of Jeffersoniana. And so there was a history of sort of Jefferson object hunting that I was able to follow a little bit in the book. But this 1787 Lafitte find was truly spectacular, and probably the most spectacular Jefferson find that there had been since his death in 1826, I think.
Which is interesting in itself, I suppose. So, and the Jefferson experts at Monticello did get involved, albeit sort of slightly obliquely in this, didn't they? And because obviously this is quite an important, if you think that you're selling a 1787 Chateau Lafitte that belongs to Thomas Jefferson, presumably you want to consult the experts. What did the Jefferson experts have to say about this find? Because they weren't really consulted that much before the sale, were they?
That's right. I mean, as I recall, I don't think that Christie's did solicit the advice of Monticello and the experts there, but what did happen was the New York Times wrote an article about this forthcoming auction because Christie's was flogging it, for the PR. And the New York Times called Monticello and asked about this bottle and, can you make sense of sort of how this could have ended up in this bricked up cellar in Paris? And Cinder Stanton, this I think maybe at the time she was Cinder Goodwin, but later became Cinder Stanton. She was the expert. She was so diligent. She was deeply familiar with Jefferson's records. And so she quickly tried to do a study on how did this correspond to the records? And I don't think she finished her research before the auction, but maybe like a week later. But she did do enough prior to the auction to tell the New York Times that, there was some reason for skepticism about this bottle just because of the specific vintage that it was and the specific chateau and the specific combination of vintage and chateau and what Jefferson's records said and the absence of any mention in his records of lost wine in Paris during the French Revolution. And
also there was something about the actual nature of the initials that had been engraved, weren't there?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't. The way they were engraved in the bottle was TH. If I'm remembering correctly, it was THJ, but I forget whether there were periods after the TH and after the J. But in any case, they did not correspond to the known ways that Jefferson had ever signed his name or even engraved a bottle, because there were some bottles that he had made reference to having like marked with a diamond in some way to indicate that they were his, but it was not nearly as camera ready as like his own initials. Let's put it that way.
Camera ready. And as you said, this man was a meticulous record keeper, but there were no specific records of these purchases ever having been made.
No, I mean, there were close ones. Like maybe there was a 1784 of maybe Lafitte, but of something of first growth. And maybe there was even a 1787, but it was not of a first growth. And there was no combination of Lafitte and 1787 in his records.
And what was the reaction from Broadbent and Rodenstock to this Jefferson expert weighing in?
I mean, they were very dismissive and sort of treated her as a clueless egghead who knew nothing about wine. Not that that was really relevant because she wasn't opining on the wine, but merely on whether or not Jefferson's records showed him to have owned a bottle like this. But so, yeah, they kind of glossed over it.
And were these reservations shared by the wine world or not? Was everyone sort of behind it and then gung-ho fever?
Pretty gung-ho. I mean, the wine world was, and especially the high-end wine world, was a pretty insular thing that wasn't of interest to a great many people outside of it. And inside that world, it was very much a culture of marketing and salesmanship and storytelling, and forensic skepticism just was not a part of the vocabulary of that world. I mean, it wasn't. It was very much against the spirit of the world. It felt very contrary to the spirit of wine. And I think like the culture of the wine world, certainly at that time, was an important part of this whole story.
But there were reservations, at least starting to grow in some circles, weren't there, and doubts about Hardy Rodenstock and his wines. Can you tell us a little bit about Herr Petrus and his legal case against Hardy Rodenstock?
Sure. So Herr Petrus was a guy named Hans Peter Frerix who had made his money like a number of these guys, many of them had made their money in sort of very boring ways. And Hans Peter Frerix, I think, was selling like windshield wipers in supermarkets and maybe like PVC gloves that were like anti-AIDS protectant gloves that at the time had been mandated by German law that every car must have, and just like weird things like that. But he'd made a lot of money and he spent a lot of it on wine, and he became the Petrus guy. And he, at a certain point, became less interested in wine, and he decided he wanted to sell his cellar. And he asked Sotheby's to handle the sale. And I don't recall whether it was because he sort of knew that Christie's was aligned with Rodenstock, but in any case, Sotheby's auctioneer David Molyneux Barry came to his home to check out the cellar, to sort of start figuring out how to put a catalog together. And Molyneux Barry became convinced that a lot of the wines in the cellar were fake. The labels didn't quite match, the labels as he knew them, things like that. There was a guy with him who was taking notes on the wines or who had the cellar book with him. And Molyneux Barry would go around, and when he saw a bottle that he thought was fake, he'd say whatever the bin number or the tag number on it. And the guy holding the cellar book would read off the source that was recorded in the cellar book for each wine. And so Molyneux Barry, would say Margaux, 1812, whatever. And the guy would be like, source, Rodenstock. And it went on and on like that. Like every time Molyneux Barry came upon a wine that was fake, he would read off the number, and the guy would look, and it would be Rodenstock. So needless to say, that made them extremely suspicious of Rodenstock. So Sotheby's refused to take the consignment. I think it was like the second time or third time in David Molyneux Barry's career that they had not taken a consignment. I mean, that's not what auctioneers don't not take consignments. That's, So Frerix was annoyed by this. And there was actually one other reason why Sotheby's refused, which was that when Rodenstock caught wind of the fact that Frerix was trying to sell his wine, he said, "Oh, no. Like, I sold you those bottles at a friendship price because of our relationship. And like, it was always understood you would not be allowed to resell them." So Frerix became very suspicious of that. Like, why would Rodenstock care if other people have an opportunity to inspect this bottle, et cetera, et cetera. So eventually Frerix sued Rodenstock. He had one of these bottles laboratory tested. The laboratory determined that the bottle must be from the nuclear age, because in the nuclear age, like every year, there are certain levels of different radioisotopes that work their way into any agricultural product that is harvested in that particular year. And so if a wine came from grapes after 1962 or whatever it was, then it would say, this wine is from 1963, this wine's from 1967. Certainly not. So his wine was clearly not from the 18th century. This began a kind of war of words in the wine press and in the German tabloids between Rodenstock and Frerix. And eventually Rodenstock said, came forth with photographs showing before and after that he said showed that Frerix had tampered with the bottle to make him look bad. Like, he had one where he's like, the bottle as I sold it to him had a high fill. The bottle Frerix is showing now has a low fill. So clearly he tampered with the bottle. So Rodenstock decided to have a counter test done, and he sent off another bottle to this, laboratory in Switzerland that I think had been the same lab that had, authenticated the Shroud of Turin, and they did their own chemical and sort of radioisotope dating. And this one seemed to vindicate Rodenstock and, said it was predated the nuclear age. Although even with those tests, there was like a ridiculously large margin of error, like plus or minus 200 years. So, I mean, it certainly didn't like pinpoint it to 1787 or whatever the vintage was. And the way that the case sort of landed in the wine world was that it was kind of a he said. It wasn't clear what the truth was. The most recent test had shown that Rodenstock was in fact in the right. I think Frericks was seen as a little bit of an unserious person, so maybe people were willing to give a little more credibility to Rodenstock. But something that was overlooked by the wine scene was that a Munich court had actually found Frericks's first bottle to contain knowingly, I think, adulterated wine. So it really had found in favor of Frericks in a fairly decisive way, but it just didn't get reported in the wine press. That I don't recall exactly why, but that particular detail was not reported, and so there just remained this kind of cloud where people who were inclined to not trust Rodenstock could not trust him. But if you basically wanted to go on being invited to his tastings and think the best of him, you could do that with good conscience.
And that Munich judgment was in 1992, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah.
And Rodenstock clearly carried on doing his own merry thing for a fair while after that. What was Rodenstock's general response to these sort of, obviously he'd been taken to court, he'd been sued, to these doubts being aired and these people, suing him?
I mean, he would insult them. He would sometimes threaten litigation. I mean, one of the features of this controversy was that often any wine magazine that reported on, let's say, Frericks's case or someone else's skepticism about Rodenstock bottles would suddenly be inundated with correspondence, often from people no one had ever heard of. Like, well, some of the letters were from a guy named Gisbert Gorky. There was another bunch from a guy named Hubert Meyer, but they all kind of sounded the same, and they all basically attacked Rodenstock's critics as idiots and praised Rodenstock.
And what do we think about the identity of these various different people?
I mean, spoiler alert, I think they were all Rodenstock.
But, despite all these doubts and adverse court judgments, did it seem at one stage as if the mystery of the Billionaire's vinegar and its finder was simply sort of fading into obscurity and there was nothing more going to come out about it?
Very much so. I mean, I think there were like little isolated groups that became disenchanted with Rodenstock, right? So you had like the German group had become disenchanted with him that included Herr Petrus. There was a California group that had become very skeptical of his bottles and had, in some tiny, obscure newsletter, they had done their own kind of, quite microscopic analyses of the corks and labels on his bottles and things like that. But in general, yeah, Rodenstock was going about his business. He still was hosting these tastings. He was still getting well-known people to attend them. I mean, a couple of the chateaux had become very skeptical of him. Like, he had a falling out with Alexandre de L'Ursulus from Yquem, among other reasons being that he told L'Ursulus that the way he was making Yquem was wrong. L'Ursulus was quite offended. And so, yeah, it kind of just had disappeared. It really had gone away.
The calm before the storm. Interesting, isn't it? About not only the Jefferson experts being somewhat sidelined, but also that 1992 Munich court decision that went largely under the radar. Yes. As Ben says, it certainly does seem like skepticism wasn't part of the vocabulary of the wine world at that time.
Yeah, it's very well put, isn't it? I mean, sometimes a story is just so good, you almost feel compelled to believe it. Even when the evidence starts stacking up to the contrary. I guess it's just the way our brains work, isn't it, really? And in the concluding parts now, we'll get on to comeuppance and the aftermath of all of this.
Hello, us again. Just letting you know, we've published a brilliant subscriber-only bonus episode, and it's one you won't want to miss.
Yes, we did a tasting of 12 top Super Tuscans, featuring some stellar names and hefty price tags like Sassicaia, Tignanello and Solaya, all blind, all from the acclaimed 2021 vintage. And this is our no-holds-barred report on that unique tasting, including our considered conclusions and thoughts on the future of the category.
And we recommend some great value alternatives to the Super Tuscans. To access the show, sign up to Wine Blast Plus. We've got an early bird offer for you. Just head to wineblast.co.uk or click the link in our show notes. Here are a couple of snippets to whet your appetite.
There was a bony tannic grip. I put like the Grim Reaper squeezing your tongue.
That's a bit
I didn't think I was necessarily being negative there, actually. I quite liked that in a funny way. Bizarre.
Do you?
Well, in a little, maybe a sort of slightly masochistic way. No fancy aromatics nor succulents. A sort of rugged tannic slap is what I wrote, old school.
Who doesn't love a rugged tannic slap? I just put it had real savoury drinkability, as well as, that hedonistic, just richness. It was really good.
In 3 words, savoury, drinkability, hedonism. That's kind of what you want in these wines, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I mean, what's wrong with hedonism? We'll agree disagreeably then.
I think on that one, yes. So let's move on to...
Disagree agreeably. I've got to get that the right way around.
Yeah, we're going to move on to... Other shows use that catchphase, and I think maybe we don't have to go down that route too much.
We don't need to go
We're just going to disagree. With wine, disagree vinously. There we go.
Oh, that's better.
These were all really good wines, right?
Yeah.
Were there any that absolutely blew you away, that made you fall in love so much you just had to buy some? I'm seeing your face at the moment, turned out to be our joint favourites.
I know, it was my top wine. I mean, by a smidgen, but this was surprisingly my top wine.
I mean, also interesting because it's one of the cheaper wines on show, which is
not like you. Never a cheap date.
Not like you. No. £95. Well, not that £95 is cheap.
Within context, it's really cheap.
Yeah. To recap so far, Hardy Rodenstock had once been feted as a golden boy among wine collectors for his uncanny ability to find and sell ultra-rare old vintages of top wine and also host lavish mega-tastings. But increasingly significant doubts were being raised about the authenticity of these wines into the 1990s and turn of the millennium. Nevertheless, there came a point when the trail seemed to have gone cold.
That was until one man decided to take matters into his own hands. I'll let Benjamin Wallace, author of The Billionaire's Vinegar, take over at this point.
In 2005, I began working full-time on this book. And one of the first things I did was go spend a week at Monticello, where they have the library, they have all the Jefferson papers, etc. And my first day at the library there, the librarian said, "So strange how there's all this interest in this suddenly. There was just someone here last month inquiring about exactly the same thing." And I, had my journalistic freak out of, oh no, I'm getting scooped by some other journalist who's also onto the story. And I waited too long because I had been kind of incubating this book for like 5 years before that. But they said, oh no, it was an investigator for a gentleman named Bill Koch, who was there at the library. So this was actually the first time I became aware of Bill Koch. And Bill Koch is a billionaire and a member of a family of billionaires that made their money in the coke and petroleum business. Very colorful guy. He had a very dramatic, litigious falling out with his brothers, including his twin brother. At one point, he had subpoenaed his own mother into court after she had a stroke. I mean, it was really like quite a thing. But Koch was less involved in the main family business and spent a lot of his time and his money collecting. And he collected a lot of things. He had won the America's Cup sailing race in 1992 just by throwing money at sort of scientifically developing a better hull. He collected, the revolver that killed Jesse James. And he had an enormous wine collection of 30 or 35,000 bottles, which he had developed his own. He had a PhD in chemical engineering, and he had developed his own filtration system to decant, his older bottles. So the Boston Museum of Fine Arts had asked Koch if he would, do an exhibit of all of his collections. I think they thought it would be kind of popular with the public. I mean, some of the snobbier people thought it was quite Philistine, that they were just letting some rich guy show off his toys, but it was going to be probably a crowd-pleasing exhibit. So one of the things that Koch wanted to have in this exhibition was his 4 Jefferson bottles, because after that initial auction, Rodenstock had continued to sell other Jefferson bottles. Eventually, Marvin Schenken, the underbidder in the 1985 auction, the Wine Spectator creator, he finally got his Jefferson bottle at a different auction. And Farr Vintners, the private merchants, had sold Coke for Jefferson bottles, all engraved with the initials. I think there was at least a Lafitte. Maybe there was a Brun Mouton, which was the earlier name of Mouton Rothschild. So in the course of preparing this exhibition for the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the museum wanted documented provenance for every object that was going to be in the show. And Koch or his curator realized they didn't really have it for these bottles. And so I think they went to Farr. Maybe they had the receipt from the sale, but I think Farr just referred them to Rodenstock. Koch's people contacted Rodenstock, who was not forthcoming with provenance. So Koch became suspicious of the origin of these bottles, and he was someone with really unlimited resources, effectively. And so he initially delegated a full-time investigator, a former FBI agent named Jim Elroy, to really dig in and see if he could determine the origin of these bottles. Eventually, other investigators became involved. It became a, world-spanning investigation with multiple investigators, a bunch of lab tests. I mean, he spent millions of dollars on this investigation, much more than he had spent on the Jefferson bottles, which I think maybe he spent $500,000 for all four. And that's really what reawakened the mystery of the Jefferson bottles.
And what did he and his crack team of investigators find out about Hardy Rodenstock, this man known as Hardy Rodenstock?
So, I mean, they found out a bunch of things. I mean, one thing was Rodenstock had always been a little bit of a cipher when it came to anything really about him beyond his wine. Like, even the people who knew him really well and best through the wine world, people like Broadbent, people like some of the other German collectors, didn't really know anything about his family history. Rodenstock had always kind of told a story about how he'd been an accomplished academic, impeccably credentialed academic at one point before he got interested in wine. People also knew him for having been the manager of a bunch of German pop acts in a genre known as Schlager, which was sort of slightly cheesy, basically pop. And but he'd been quite successful as a manager in that, but then he'd gotten into wine as a hobby, but no one knew anything about really his personal history. So Koch's investigators found, among other things, that he'd come from a humbler background than he had claimed, that he, I think, had been born maybe in Poland and then ended up in a refugee camp. This was during World War II or right after World War II. And his name was not Hardy Rodenstock. I mean, Rodenstock had always either said or implied that he was a member of this very wealthy German family, the Rodenstocks, that had made their money in the optics business. He had no connection to them. Rodenstock was a name he had taken on later. His real name was Meinhard Gurke. And in fact, it turned out that Gisbert Gurke, the guy, one of the names of people who'd been sending these letters to the magazines, was his brother, who Koch's investigator gratuitously described as a very small-sized man. And Rodenstock had two kids, I think Oliver and Torsten Gurke, but no one in his circles really knew this. I mean, there was one guy, his sort of pet sommelier sidekick, who at some point had accidentally found out because he was in a restaurant and the waiter had said, "Oh, I read about you in the paper. I think you know my father is Meinhard Gurke," and he's like, "What?" And, Hardy Rodenstock. So that's how he found out. But no one else knew this. So he really was someone who had kind of reinvented or invented himself.
And then Koch's investigators also discovered an intriguing case about Hardy Rodenstock's or Meinhard Gurke's former landlord. Can you tell us about that too?
One of Hardy Rodenstock's homes was a twin, with another house in Munich. And the person who lived in the other half of the building in the other twin was the landlord. They owned the property. And at some point, they ended up in a landlord-tenant dispute for various reasons. It was mold in the attic, I think. And at some point, Rodenstock refused to move out and was demanding increasingly high amounts of money to move out. And then at some point, because of the mold, he temporarily did move out, but he did not relinquish his tenant rights. And I think the landlord who lived in the other half of the house got it in his head that if he could prove that Rodenstock was actually working out of this other half of the building, he could use that to get him out of there because he was declaring Munich as his residence or something. And so he went into the Rodenstock half of the house when Rodenstock wasn't there. And in the basement, he found empty old wine bottles, a stack of blank wine labels, old labels. He found a pile of dirt with a dead frog in it and with mold all over it. And it became very clear to him. Oh, and also, I mean, he'd been hearing for years, he'd been hearing this like hammering, which he knew Rodenstock was in the wine business, but it sounded like he was hammering wine crates together, wine cases. And he couldn't for the life of him figure out why Rodenstock would be doing this grunt work when he's this kind of like flashy high-end wine dealer. And so it became the picture gelled for Andreas Klein, this landlord in the other half of the house, that Rodenstock was obviously, and he read about the lawsuits, obviously this was Rodenstock's laboratory where he was creating his old bottles of wine.
Didn't they discover something about he'd owned a sort of perfumes business? Is that right?
I mean, that was a sort of tantalizing, bit of trivia that Koch's investigators found that Rodenstock did own a business that, made perfumes or essences that were used in the manufacture of perfumes. And that was intriguing, but they never really learned any more about it, so it didn't go anywhere. But it did occur to them that, if he has sort of these professional chemical mixologists on his payroll, that would be handy for someone who is concocting, very specific tastes of wine.
And Koch's team also homed in on one particular detail about the engraving on the Jefferson bottles, didn't they? Which led to a quite remarkable conclusion. Can you tell us about that?
In the time of Thomas Jefferson and the 1780s, the way that engraving was done was using a method called copper wheel engraving, where the person would, I think, they'd use a pedal, sort of a pneumatic pedal, to turn a wheel that made of copper that would be used to make these engravings. And so Koch's investigator took his bottles up to the Corning Museum of Glass in Corning, New York, where there's some very skilled glass experts, and they examined the engravings and said they could not have, and they took like another bottle and tried to duplicate the engravings on the Jefferson bottles using copper wheel engraving, and they could not. And they ultimately determined that the only way to have made the engraving was using a modern power tool, such as a dentist's drill.
A dentist's drill?
Yeah.
How did the Koch case end up?
So Koch sued Rodenstock in New York. I don't remember why he thought he had jurisdiction there. Maybe because he had sold a bunch of other bottles that Koch had bought through New York merchants. And basically, Rodenstock initially participated, like he responded to the filings. He hired a New York lawyer. But eventually, Rodenstock just stopped responding to filings. He, got rid of his lawyer. And that was kind of the end of it. And so Koch won what's called a default judgment, where the court finds in your favor. And he was awarded damages, but then it's sort of an academic question because could he collect on those damages? And I don't think he ever could, because Rodenstock then moved to Austria. He sort of sheltered himself within European tax laws or European privacy laws and jurisdictional, boundaries. But he did end up having a lot of his own tax problems in those countries because I think he was living in Austria, but claiming Munich was his residence. And so independent of all of this wine stuff, he had a bunch of tax problems he had to deal with over there. But Koch never really got any further justice against Rodenstock.
And what was the reaction in the wider wine world to all of this?
I mean, I think there was a gradual dawning, a gradual kind of waking up from the slumber of the romance of the wine world, where nothing like this could ever happen, would ever happen. You shouldn't even ask questions like that, etc. I think the bloom was off the rose. The innocence was lost, It took a while. I mean, Broadbent continued to insist that the bottles were authentic. He never conceded any ground there. I mean, he always maintained that they were authentic. I think he did believe that, but I think it was sort of a artifact of just psychological self-delusion. I think he wanted to believe that. He needed to believe that. He'd really staked his reputation in a lot of ways on that. I mean, his big book of sort of the tastes of wine historically, all of the rarest ones in there that really distinguished it as something no one else would ever be able to replicate were Rodenstock sourced bottles. The 1985 sale was a huge deal for him. So he did not necessarily have an awakening, but I think most other people did.
And ultimately, the case was never definitively proven against Rodenstock.
Right. There was never a criminal finding against Rodenstock. Even Koch's case was not a criminal case. It was a civil case, seeking money damages, and a default judgment is not the same as a finding of culpability or guilt.
And do we still think that, sort of almost 20 years further down the line, is that still the obviously there hasn't been a criminal finding against him, but what's the general body of opinion nowadays, do you think?
I'd be surprised if there's anyone in the world alive today who thinks Rodenstock was on the up and up.
And just from a personal point of view, your book, The Billionaire's Vinegar, was published in 2008. Can you remember what the reaction was at that time to the book being published?
It was pretty good. I would say when I was working on the book, I encountered a certain amount of resistance and reticence because, that was still before the bloom was not yet off the rose. And so I was fighting a little bit against that culture of not really scrutinizing everything. But, by the time that my book came out, like Koch's lawsuits had already been well publicized. So it wasn't like brand new news. And so my book was seen as kind of just documenting a thing that had happened in the world. Rodenstock certainly didn't like it. I think he told a Bloomberg reporter that it was what he called a Märchenbuch, which I'm told means fairy tale, and in German. And Bill Koch actually didn't like it, even though I think I give him his due as, like, in many ways the hero of the story. But I portrayed some of his peccadillos, and I don't think he loved that. And Michael Broadbent was interesting because after I sent him the book, he left me a voicemail, or at the time it was actually, I think, on a physical answering machine. This was not, 2008. And saying, I was worried I wasn't going to, I have to say, I was quite nervous about this book, and I was worried, about what it might say, but I really like it. Like it's really, well written, and I was like, oh, that's great. That's nice. That did not last. That feeling and sentiment did not last. I forget whether it was 1 year later or 2 years later, but Broadbent sued my publisher for, I imagine, defamation. It must have been defamation in the UK. As your listeners may or may not know, UK libel law is different from the law in the US. In the US, the burden is on the person who claims they've been libeled to prove that to prove that what was said was false. And in the UK, at least at that time, the burden was on the journalist to prove that what they wrote was true. So eventually, the publisher defended the case for a while, eventually having spent more money than they wanted to spend and not basically made a business decision to settle with Broadbent. They apologized in open court to him, and they agreed to no longer sell the book in the UK. Simultaneously, they issued a statement strongly supporting me. They didn't change a word of the book, and they continued to distribute it everywhere else unchanged.
Well, how did you react to that personally?
I don't love that they made the business. I understand the business decision they made. I don't love it. I don't love that they apologized, because that was just a sort of insincere litigation posture made for economic reasons. But I understand it as a corporation. One thing I've always said and felt and did at the time is that I don't think I did libel Michael Broadbent. I don't think I portray him as a malefactor or as anyone who did anything sort of intentionally improper. I do think he was a salesman. He was a very competitive salesman, extremely competitive with Sotheby's. This was a huge coup for him. And I think he kind of had the salesman's blinders on. And I just think this was a blind spot for him. And he became so invested in that relationship and what it had meant for his reputation that he couldn't see it clearly. And so I wish he hadn't ended up feeling the way he did about the book. I always felt good feelings toward him and kind of thought he was in many ways a kind of a great man, but it was what it was.
And what became of Hardy Rodenstock?
He kind of faded into the gloaming. He apparently did continue to hold some like private commercial tastings, but he basically kind of faded away. I think he spent a lot of time at Kitzbühel, where he was married for a while to a former German actress. And then in 2018, he died.
And nothing more has happened on that front since.
Not with Rodenstock. I mean, it would have been satisfying if like some member of his family had come forward with some kind of either, deathbed confession from their dad or just their own accusation or evidence. That would have been kind of narratively pleasing, but it did not happen.
So 40 years on from that famous auction sale in 1985 of the 1787 Jefferson Lafitte that marks the dramatic start to your book, how do you think the world has changed since then, and the world of fine wine has changed?
I mean, I do think there's been a broader reckoning in the wine world that like fraud is a real thing. It happens at the high end. I think some of the chateaux have put in place better protections like RFID chips in bottles and things like that make them more traceable. But the other thing is like this really was an artifact of a moment in time because Broadbent found all the old wine. He got all the old wine. He sold all the old wine. A lot of that old wine was drunk. There's less and less of that old wine. And even of the old wine that has survived, it's now like so old that it's probably not drinkable anymore. So if it ever was. And so I do think in that sense that, you're never going to have another scene with like 125-year-old bottles being found because that's done. The supply was depleted.
Benjamin, thank you very much indeed.
Peter, thanks so much for having me.
So we're talking a dentist's drill, a dead frog, a change of name, and a secret family.
Don't be getting any ideas. Really though, that's not all. That's not all. After Ben's book was published, German magazine Stern tracked down a printing company in Germany where several employees testified that Rodenstock had frequently commissioned the firm to reprint old wine labels. More than that, Stern got hold of labels of supposedly Mouton 1900 that came from Rodenstock, and chemical analysis showed that the label was backed by modern synthetic glue, not invented until years later.
Despite all of this, though, there was never a criminal judgment against Hardy Rodenstock, was there?
No, which is worth,
Yeah, no satisfying conclusion to the story. Other than the wine world, I guess, being forced to start taking the issue seriously, even if not eradicating the problem, because frauds are still a big issue, as we discussed in our Fate Wine episode.
We did, along with Homer Simpson, but that's another matter. And of course, that's a shame because it just erodes trust. And, a lot of wine is about trust, but the wine world really does need to become more transparent from producers to middlemen to merchants to auctioneers, which is what Maureen Downey was saying in that episode, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that does seem to be happening, but just quite slowly. Is that a fair way of...
Yeah. And in the meantime, we got some other input, didn't we, from people like Serena Sutcliffe and Jancis Robinson too, didn't we?
We did. Both of whom figure in the Billionaire's Vinegar story. Jancis in her role as journalist and Serena as head of wine for auctioneer Sotheby's. Jancis called Rodenstock spooky when we spoke and said he clearly derived pleasure from seeing his friends cheated. Serena said, and a quote, Hardy Rodenstock was a disgrace, and so were the people who sold his wines, an insult to those of us who love wine and wish always to protect its integrity.
Certainly not mincing words. And perhaps an appropriate note to end on. By way of closing summary, while the mystery of the world's most expensive bottle of wine may not have been conclusively resolved either way, it does now seem likely that the story was just too good to be true. The naive romanticism of the wine world has been challenged. The trade tasked with adapting and evolving. Meantime, the story lives on as a cautionary but entertaining tale that all wine lovers would be wise to heed.
Thanks to Benjamin Wallace. The Billionaire's Vinegar really is an excellent read. You can also get Ben's latest book, The Mysterious Mr. Nakamoto, a 15-year quest to unmask the secret genius behind crypto, in all good bookstores now. Finally, thanks to you for listening. Until next time, cheers. Thank you for listening right to the end of the programme. You deserve some sort of medal or
maybe a glass of fine wine, whatever. Either way, if you're a regular Wine Blast listener, you'll know we do occasional sponsorships, both episodic and headline. You might not have thought of this, but if you're involved with a company, brand or region who could benefit from exposure to a top-notch global community of wine lovers, get in touch.
Wine Blast goes out to 200 countries and thousands of listeners. It's won multiple awards and is regularly one of the highest ranking drinks shows in global charts, with a knack of making national and international headlines, despite being a totally independent production made with a lot of passion and hard graft. If you'd like to support the show and take your message to an ever-growing global audience, get in touch by emailing contact@susieandpeter.com. That address is also on our website show notes, or you can find us on social media.